have to put you. Hello, I think you can hear me now. There we go. Good evening and welcome. Everything's kind of here. It's 24th of August, and this is the third, I believe, of these kind of Monday night philosophy research discussions. This is my partner, wife. Where's your mic? Because
Morrigan will do.
Okay, Morrigan. That's true. It is Morrigan. That's her mic. So she should sound fine. Fine. Hopefully we won't overlap too much. So I'm just going to ask her. You see this mute button here? Yes, she's switched it off now. So she's going to switch that on and off. So hopefully we won't overlap too much. But that isn't a way of keeping her quiet. Yeah, that's not the idea. It's just so that the audio doesn't go madness. Right. So today I wanted to talk a little bit more and continue some of the conversation I had last week about desire and revolutionary politics. And so I've done my review and I've gone through what I said last week. Kind of remembered bits of it, and obviously bits of it you don't remember. And so I want to continue that a little bit. Before that, I kind of wanted to comment on a couple of things that Machinadas had said in his sort of voice message, which I did put online onto YouTube. If you want to see that, put Machinadas' thing onto YouTube, all that kind of stuff, so you can look it up. So where was Machinadas? There was a couple of things that I was. Well, first of all, he was talking at one point about a story from the Norse mythology, Tale of Utgarda Loki. So that was an interesting thing, and if you want to look it up, that's the story's name, the Tale of Utgarda Loki, and I'll mention that in a moment. The idea was he was referencing that story because it was to do with the challenge, to challenge power, you need a kind of great ambition. And he was sort of referencing this particular sort of situation in which Thor's wandering around and gets caught up in some contest with the ice giants, and gets challenged to do a bunch of stuff, like drink a big mug of mead or whatever it is, and can barely he can't really complete the challenges, but in fact it's all a big con, and so the big mug of mead is actually the oceans of the world that the giants have kind of messed around with, and possibly Loki has messed around with. But the idea that I think Paul was talking about the idea that you need to have this almost the ambition to be able to drink the ocean kind of level of ambition if you actually want to challenge power. And it was connected to something he was saying, which I think I hope I'm not sort of massively misinterpreting, but he was kind of saying something like, or I felt like he was saying something like, difficulty of a kind of liberal response to fascism, the difficulty of a kind of moderated response to fascism, one that isn't angry, annoyed, passionate, is that it's just not sufficient to challenge that level of corruption, and to a certain extent the difficulty of a kind of moderated or liberal response to things like the climate crisis. I spoke about a couple of weeks ago. So and that touches on something to do with this relationship. Hopefully a lot. I'm kind of talking about sort of obliquely, but this relationship to what might be called fanaticism or enthusiasm. And there was a lot of discussion around this at the time of the French Revolution, because obviously the French Revolution begins with a kind of enthusiasm for human rights and goes into this kind of moment of what's called the terror, and the enthusiasm for Enlightenment ideals becomes a kind of fanaticism. And there's a lot of interesting conversations in Kant and various other people about whether this enthusiasm can be kind of politically competent, whether it's always going to end up in a kind of production of the terror like the French Revolution. And that, I think, is a kind of it's a sort of slightly different way of thinking about the same thing that I'm kind of interested in terms of relationship to fascism and micropolitics, micro desires, the way in which I kind of think that the revolutionary the desire, when the revolutionary encounters desire, when revolutionary politics or revolutionary organisations encounter sort of a philosophy of desire, politics of desire, they're worried about the fanaticism, they're worried about the enthusiasm, they're worried about the terror, they're worried about that kind of moment, and this is a kind of it's a kind of bogeyman. It's a kind of ghost in the machine that I feel like often is presented by kind of liberal politics to say, well, look, every attempt at revolution, every kind of, any identification as revolutionary has this kind of really hidden kind of ghost in it that's terror. And in fact, I think Machinados was right to point out that it's the other way around in a sense. How are you actually going to be able to challenge power unless you have this enormous ambition, like Thor with regard to giants and the drink in the ocean, or like an ambition sufficient to challenge corruption. So I'll possibly return to a couple of other things that Machinados has talked about to me at another point. But what I wanted to do first, is there anything you want to say there? You okay with that? I could feel you maybe wanting to comment.
Well, you managed to talk about all of that without mentioning violence, which is interesting. Because I kind of like wonder really whether people's a couple of points, whether people, if they object to what's going on in Black Lives Matter protests, or protests that are branded as Black Lives Matter, whether they're actually really that concerned about Rousseau and the terror, whether they really know what happened after the French Revolution, or whether it's around issues of violence and who gets to hold the power to commit acts of violence and who doesn't.
Yes. Okay. So that is something I've had a conversation with Eric about recently. About yes, whether in fact some of the discourse around violent protest, probably an easy way of putting it, is completely missing the background idea around the legitimation of violence. And so what I mean by that is, it's perfectly fine for cops to have guns in America, but as soon as you're a black guy or a black woman in an urban area, even if it's legal, and you carry a gun, you're immediately violent by the very act that you're carrying out a constitutional right. It's not like they're doing something illegal in certain spaces. And so and even the way that someone on the left will perceive that, they will perceive the legitimacy. It seems okay. It might seem odd for a British person to see an American sort of gun-carrying cop, but it still seems okay. Whereas there's a different visceral response, and I have this. So I have it in maybe the wrong way. I kind of see when I see working class, black communities armed and defending themselves on a demonstration, I have a kind of joy in that, the kind of pleasure, or kind of that's brilliant. So even I'm perceiving a differential relationship, but I think when we perceive that as a negative, it's because we've already assumed that there's only one legitimate source of violence, and in a sense there's no legitimate source of violence, or there's only or everyone's a legitimate source of violence. And it's a much more complicated question. Yes. When it came to the French, let's move. We'll come back to things like this. So as I say, what I wanted to talk about is to continue a little bit on from last week's conversation, in which I was trying to talk about this relationship between desire and revolutionary organisation, revolutionary politics, and in particular, something that I was describing as the tension of social desire. And this tension of social desire kind of rises from this situation in which we seem to have two options when it comes to desire. We seem to be presented with two options. We seem to have the individual subjectivity option and the group, the group option, the group mob option, and this sort of option between, and this group mob option, this sort of mobilization of desire as a group is often sort of connected to being fascistic. It's often what we might call the fascist mobilization of group desire. So whenever we see a mob on the street, a motorcycle gang or a football group, or any of these kind of groups where desire has been mobilized and it's taking expression in a group form, we kind of perceive, there's a perception of that as kind of latent fascism. And fascism itself is a mobilization of micro desire in a sense. I mean, I think I used the phrase, I did actually write down, fascism has so far been the most efficient mobilization of desire we have so far encountered in politics. And so the tension is between this encounter with like the group that's mobilized by desire and the individual subjectivity, which kind of presents itself as a kind of innate, automatic, resistance to that fascism. And so once we encounter like the dynamic of actual, present fascism, the name of the word, the name, the concept coming into politics, as we are obviously doing with Trump in America and with the various latent fascist movements and with things like Bolsonaro in Brazil. Once we encounter that concept of fascism in politics, we kind of see these two options, group mobilization of desire and the subjective individual, as the only options, and we see group mobilizations of desire as automatic allies of the political concept of fascism. And so any kind of mobilization of a group then becomes kind of a way in which fascism is going to be enabled. And so for the revolutionary, the revolutionary response is often then misunderstood, because the revolutionary response cannot, or does not, I don't think, begin from this dualism between groups being kind of fascistic and individuals being anti-fascistic. It doesn't begin from that point. It begins from something beyond the dualism of fascism and the individual. It begins from a different kind of tension. It begins from a different kind of space than the tension, rather, between the group and the individual, which is the tension of social desire. So any kind of social desire caught in this tension between group and individual. And so, you want to be part of, the group, but that sort of wanting to be part of, that wanting to bind yourself into, that wanting to connect yourself, that's kind of supposedly this model of the tension that's kind of going to lead to fascism, and anything separating out from that is kind of the anti-fascist, and that's how we kind of perceive society. But the revolutionary doesn't operate with that dualism, and so I think they kind of get misunderstood when they talk about mobilizing against the fascists on the streets, when they talk about using groups, using mobs, using collective power. And it's because of this misunderstanding that quite often you end up with this kind of bad way of describing fascism and anti-fascism as somehow just two sides of the same coin. The same coin being group desire. And so any group desire is inherently the two sides of the same coin, particularly any group desire that's willing to sort of confrontational. And that's exactly what we see inside the liberal discourse in America, and to a certain extent in Britain, where any attempt by Antifa or whatever they want to call it to mobilize a different kind of collective desire is just, it's just perceived as exactly the same. So I think this is kind of one of the difficulties. That's kind of the difficulty that's interesting me here, because I don't think that the current mode in which that's kind of encountered and countered by left discourse is very adequate, because essentially left discourse just goes, no, it's not the same, and it's not the same because they're nasty right wingers and we're good left wingers. It's not the same because they're nasty racists and we're good anti-racist. And it's somehow as though the ideas can define the dynamic of the desire. And I think this is one of the difficulties, is that actually there is much more of a complex problem here, in the sense in which there is an element of fascism with a small f within group desire. There is a very strong element of that within group desire. Whether it's left or right. And this was something I think that Anti-Oedipus and 1,000 Plateaus and Deleuze and Guattari perhaps more, were trying to pinpoint. And that's kind of the background to the conversation, or the background to the thinking at the moment. And so it's very specifically focused on, as I say, this at the moment, this very sort of curious problem that's almost specific to a very small group of people, the revolutionary. And the problem is something like, how do we mobilize desire without at the same time mobilizing kind of fascism. Is that even possible? Can we do that? And one of the things I said last week is that one of the difficulties is that the revolutionary organizations as they exist, revolutionaries as they exist, as it were, when they talk about binding, they are using archaic notions. Now, why does that matter? Why am I using this word binding? So what fascism does is it is essentially a process of binding desires together. That's what enabled them to become group desire. A group desire isn't fundamentally like a bunch of sheep following a leader. Not how group desire operates. A group desire is a bunch of sort of desires that are bound together. And this process of binding, psychoanalysis is essentially, the origin of this process, or this idea of binding. And it will talk about the way in which, libidinal desires, for example, get attached to objects. This is a process of binding. We'll talk about the way in which elements of our, we can call subjectivity here, elements of our individuality can be brought together and held together and be held consistently. And again, this is a process of binding. And so binding is a kind of bringing together of desires. And so when we talk about social desire and group desire, it's plainly a kind of process that involves some dynamics of binding, some dynamics of bringing together, being part of one, being intertwined. And I think inside revolutionary politics, when I say their tools of binding are archaic, I think this is the fundamental problem that they're often dealing with. The tools of fascism, tools of fascist binding are archaic often as well. They're often using notions of tradition or invented tradition. They're often using notions of things like the real way the family should operate, a kind of invented notion. It's always been like this. They're often using notions of natural, again, a kind of invented notion. But they're not trying to be progressive. They're not trying to do something that goes forward. They're trying to, in a sense, return to something where, and they're kind of inventing this idea that they're returning to. They invent the enemy for doing that. And so if the left does the same, if it kind of invents this enemy, also has to ask, well, where are we going to? And this is in a sense where the kind of problem can be seen most clearly, is that most left politics is unable to sort of deal with a language that doesn't refer back to something like 1917 or 1936. It's got this historical weight to it, which becomes its future. And it kind of has no ability at the moment to really kind of cope with, I think, or construct an image of communism as a horizon, as sometimes people call it.
But isn't I mean, if you talk about isn't the term not even just the term revolutionary, isn't the idea of revolutionary archaic itself? So in fact, it almost predates fascism in a way. So to identify with something that's a very archaic concept is itself not looking forwards. It's sort of tied to the past, and without looking forwards, then it's very difficult to capture the imagination of what the future might look like, or something like that.
I mean, okay, that's a really good point, and would kind of destroy my argument. Yeah, right, okay. So no, but that's a fair point. I mean, okay, revolutionary may itself be a kind of archaism. I suppose would counter that by saying, when I'm talking about a revolutionary, I'm talking about a particular kind of dynamic a dynamic of engagement with regard to society and with regard to the social that it takes in a particular direction. In other words, it takes it away from the hierarchy. It takes it away from kings. It takes it away from centralized leaders, or it generally speaking has a dynamic away from, we might call, the state. So that's obviously, there's a huge problem there, but it has this particular, it's a line of dynamic, a line of possible response to the social, whereas the fascist is another line of response to the social. So
isn't the but isn't the kind of difference almost that the revolutionary is revolting, you know, whereas the fascist is sort of falling in behind the power structures in a way.
Possibly. I mean, this is a kind of these are. I mean, there is, I suppose, a very important question there, which maybe I need to sort of think about and kind of articulate as to, you know, why the revolutionary is a kind of valid figure, not just a simple archaism. So at the moment I'm kind of working with the idea that the philosopher, the revolutionary, the sorcerer, these are all kind of social figures. They're all figures in relationship to the social, and in relationship to thought. And so the philosopher, for example, is opposed to, or not opposed to, is contrasted with something called the sophist. Sophistry. People know what sophistry is. So the philosopher is contrasted with the sophist, who's someone who does sophistry. And right, so there's that kind of notion. The sorcerer is I'm not exactly sure who exactly the opposite of the sorcerer is, but I would probably say the priest. Yeah, right. This is the kind of conversation, but perhaps not, because perhaps this, by definition, the sorcerer is always something at the edge of the. And the revolutionary is someone who's, in a sense, willing to sacrifice the social on behalf of something like the individual. Something like yes. Essentially, they're willing to break the law, not have the law, because it's more important for to have justice, or it's more important to have equality, or it's more important to have some kind of removal of oppression than it is to obey the law, than it is to obey the social. Whereas the reaction, so it's a crude way of sort of saying that, but that's the kind of role of the revolutionary. So they're sort of willing to sacrifice the social for that kind of. It's not even ideal. Quite often, it's a reality, an actual. Whereas the reactionary is willing to sacrifice the person or the people for the social. They want to, because of the binding, overridden. It's not. We don't want chaos, as it were. It's the archetypal sort of language of the reactionary. And so, at the moment, obviously, the revolutionary in the kind of Western capitalist countries, and to a certain extent outside of Western capitalism as well, in sort of neo-colonial and colonized places, and outside of those in places like China and the East, the figure of the revolutionary is at this moment in time obviously deeply bound up with the red flag, communism, anarchism, and probably has been for about 200 years ago. So when we're talking about the revolution now, we're not talking about so much French revolutionary. We're talking about a specifically sort of historical context. And this, I kind of think, is what is why, in a sense, we're dealing with this problematic of language, this problematic of a kind of archaic set of concepts. So it's worth just having a kind of like methodological point here. So when I'm talking about language, one of the things I don't think language is autonomous. I don't think it operates on its own. I don't think there's I don't think language has any kind of innate meaning either. It's a kind of organization of meaning. But most importantly, I think language is always part of what Deleuze and Guattari call a collective assemblage of enunciation. So what's important about this is that it's always bodies and words connected together. You can't have words without bodies. You can have bodies without words. But whenever there's a language, it's not as it were in the head. It's not as it were written down in paper. Or it's not in the vocabulary. It's not in the dictionary. That's not where you find language. Language is, and what wouldn't be meant by this jargon, collective assemblage of enunciation, is something like, I sort of said, used last time I was talking about, it can be sort of used almost the same as some people use the idea of discourse, or some people use the idea of language games. So it's more than context, because it has both bodies and words connected together. And when we're talking about bodies, we're also sort of, the phrase would probably be better: bodies, actions, and passion. And by bodies, I don't just mean human bodies. I mean everything. Everything that has a material kind of. BAPS. Okay, that's a terrible. That's an acronym. But yeah, okay, BAPS. So there's BAPS and words. So yeah, bodies, actions, and passions. And by bodies, I mean cars or books or physical objects, not just human beings. Actions, stuff that they do, and passions, the kind of interactions, the likings and dislikings, the kind of value judgments almost. So that's on the one hand, and on the other hand, there's the words, and a collective assemblage of enunciation is a particular collection of these things, and the words that can be expressed by a particular set of bodies, actions, and passions are limited and determined to a large extent by those bodies, actions, and passions, because that's what the words are doing. They're expressing a specific group of bodies, or a specific way in which bodies are organized. And so if you want to be able to say something different, you need to reorganize the bodies. And if you want to understand something that you don't understand, you need to look at the bodies that are saying it. So when an example, it would have been impossible perhaps for in a general conversation for me to say something like, can you mute yourself? And for most people to understand it. It would have been a very specific kind of situation. Now we've been using Zoom, it's so widespread. And I don't mean just for people are using it for their families and things. If you were to say to someone, can you mute yourself? Or can you Zoom? These would be meaningful and entirely, productive sets of words and expressions. Because of the reorganisation of bodies, actions, and passions that's occurred during the COVID crisis, at least in the UK, in which Zoom and video conferencing has become much more ubiquitous and has therefore enabled a kind of new phrase or a new way of talking or a new sentence to come into being. And that sentence isn't capable of being understood outside of the organisation of that particular set of bodies, actions, and passions, which in this case involves things like webcams and Zoom. But those kind of that collective assemblage of enunciation has shifted, therefore, when we began to sort of move online and use Zoom or something. But also, it's by thinking about a collective assemblage of enunciation, this kind of twofold thing, that we can understand what slangs are. When we find slangs from like subcultural groups, for example, we're talking about a specific kind of thing that can be said within a particular context of bodies. Or polari, which the gay community used as a mode of communication. That was again a kind of, a collective assemblage of enunciation has to be kind of, thought of in order to understand what's going on there. And also just technical jargon. There's again a collective assemblage of enunciation. There's certain in technical jargon, there are certain techniques, those are actions. There are certain things the techniques are applied to, bodies, and there are certain reasons that they're applied to them, certain values that they can be done well or badly. Those are the passions. And without those bodies, shorthand, you can't really understand what the words are. So when we think about or apply this concept to revolutionary, and to revolutionary organizations, we can kind of ask, well, what about the body's actions and passions? Where and how are they? Where and how have they changed? What kind of acts and statements can be said by a revolutionary depend, to a large extent, on the body's actions and passions of those revolutionaries. And for a large chunk, or for the dominant chunk of the 20th century, those bodies, actions, and passions were the communist parties, the USSR, the socialist states. Now perhaps we've got other kind of bodies, actions, and passions, because it's no longer that Cuba or China or something is the dominant notion of what communist is, revolutionary. Now perhaps some people might turn to Rojava as a kind of idea of revolution, or they might turn to the Zapatistas in Mexico as an idea of what a revolutionary looks like, what can be. And so this, I think, is what I kind of mean, is that there's an archaism in the language the revolutionary uses, or that the language of the revolutionary, because the bodies have not really begun to be able to be coordinated very well in terms of their expression. because we're still thinking in terms of, in terms of something. I'm not quite sure what, but in terms of something that doesn't seem to be a very coherent expression of the revolutionary or the position of the revolutionary.
I'm just really reminded of that track by Wanda Robinson. What's it called? About the black woman who's pregnant, the warrior woman. Do you know which one I'm talking about?
I think I do.
This is potentially not a very good intervention,
no.
But in terms of
I can't actually play any music on Twitch because it just gets immediately banned.
But in terms of bodies, actions, and passions, it's an extremely. It's funny how music manages to bridge that gap between the kind of like the language, the saying, the unsaid, the archaic, the present, the future, the past, and the kind of like the moment, which is what she does in that track, which I will now feel compelled to go and find behind me in the record pile. But yeah.
Yes, I mean that's fine. You probably can't put it on there either because we can't we can't play any bloody music. So yeah, that's fine. You do that. So that's. I mean, I suppose that's kind of the problem. Is what do the revolutionary bodies look like? What are they able to express by this? Now, I think one of the things that occurred after the fall of the Soviet Union and the kind of, I mean, it was already well underway in the collapse of the Communist Party, was a kind of collapse of the model of a revolutionary organisation. And there's always been many models. There's always been many kind of different ways of doing it. But that there had been a dominant model, and the dominant model had taken the name of the Communist Party, and even when it had become kind of something that was be opposed by other communists, they took up other names like Trotsky, Maoist, or anarchist, in order to kind of orientate themselves as different from, but kind of connected to, the communist project, the revolutionary projects that have taken that dominant form. And those forms all kind of dissipated. So now we have this kind of strange sense in which the idea of a revolutionary, Apple Mac can almost claim to be revolutionary, in the recent kind of curious fight between Epic Games, Fortnite, and Apple. They can be presented as this kind of revolutionary without it being completely ridiculous, in a sense. I mean, it is a bit ridiculous, but without it being completely ridiculous. And so when we think of what a revolutionary is now, it's very difficult for us to kind of, immediately have an image of that. Whereas I would say that for a long time in the 20th century, the idea of a revolution was something like the anarchist or the communist. Those were kind of the dominant modes. And in fact, that's not surprising, because realistically, these are the dominant traditions of the revolutionary in the last 200 years, anarchism or communism. Generally speaking, if you're a revolutionary, you're going to pick up one kind of flavour or other of those dominant traditions. In fact, I think that's about 150. So one of the questions is, what do the bodies look like? And so I kind of thought, well, how in a sense did my body change as a revolutionary from when I was in one position of the age of 15, 16. I kind of got involved in revolutionary politics when I was sort of maybe 15, 16, maybe a little bit earlier, but that was really about 15, 16. And how did it change between then and now? And one of the ways in which it changed and sort of reorganized itself was in relationship to organization, in relationship to a kind of community or a kind of specific, not party, because they weren't really parties, but specific sort of, set of other people. And so as I became involved in revolutionary politics, I became connected to a specific revolutionary organization. That was actually in the Trotskyist tradition. And that became kind of the place that would be able to organize those bodies and enable certain things to be said. But one of the things also that has to be noted about a collective assemblage of enunciation is that it also prevents certain things from being said. And so that was my initial, encounter, this kind of organisation into a revolutionary. And then as I sort of fulfilled that role, what happened is that I ended up going to prison for being on the poll tax front, and at that point was kind of in disagreement with other people inside my own organisation, but in a way that seemed part of a legitimate dissensus, part of a reasonable disagreement. But those reasonable disagreements very quickly become kind of conflictual. They become someone trying to win. And so if you don't win, if you lose, as I would have done in kind of my conversational disagreement, then you're kind of disorganized. You're kind of, you yourself or the organization kind of expels you as part, or you leave in exile. And that's kind of a dynamic in which a lot of revolutionary organizations still seem to work, in which people become part of the organization. They get to a certain point at which they feel like they're able to say something that would be disagreeable. And at that point, they either kind of win their point or lose their point. And if they lose, they kind of be expelled or exiled. They will kind of leave, or someone will chuck them out. And those that win, obviously, become smaller and smaller and smaller. And so the revolutionary organization seems to be organized around this kind of, bringing people together, but having a blockage at a certain point at which disagreement actually takes place. Particularly disagreement when it's not just one or two people sort of disagreeing, when you kind of collectively disagree. So then I took a process of being more anarchist in my kind of evolutionary politics, and so went through a period where I would be kind of loosely connected to squats or help out with things that were going on around the area, and then would be attending globalization dynamics, and so you were part of a kind of network process of like loose contacts. And of course that's great, that's easy because you don't get expelled or exiled, you don't get kind of kicked out or leave, but it's also much more amorphous. You're always in a sense kind of you're always kind of in a sense only organized as a body at the point at which you're on the streets, the point at which you're in a demonstration, the point at which you're actually picketing something. At that point, well, it's not even, the point at which you're actually kind of in a kind of confrontation. So you're not so in between times it's a kind of disorganization, and it doesn't, and in a sense what is going on at that point is everything else around you is organizing you, and so the revolutionary organization is not in that particular role. And then later in my life, about 5 years ago, 4 or 5 years ago, I decided to again get involved in a kind of formal organization, but on the basis that this particular organization, because that's Plan C, that this one didn't have a line and didn't have a kind of fixed position, and had this kind of idea of encouraging people to dissent. And so that's essentially, I think, the kind of model that I'm interested in. Now, why I'm telling you that particular story, why I'm trying to sort of talk about that, is because it's the kind of one of the primary data I have as a revolutionary, is how have I and how's my body been organized as through that those periods, those kind of 3 periods, if you like, the primary body period, which are kind of brought into an organization in which you encounter this difficulty of dissensus, then the networked period, and then this attempt to organize a body that's premised on dissensus. And I think what's been fascinating in a sense is that a similar kind of dynamic, in particular relating to dissensus, in particular relating to disagreement, has taken place in my work as a philosopher and in my work as a sorcerer. And so I don't believe. So what that makes me think of is that this is not particular to revolutions. It is much more particular to the way in which bodies are organised. And so the more I can go into those at another time, but essentially the same kind of dynamic, slightly different stages perhaps, has taken place as I say, sort of philosophy and sorcery. At the point at which you're able to comfortably dissent, you encounter this relationship between exile and expulsion, and then you encounter this kind of relationship to networked structures. You kind of encounter this much more amorphous kind of relationship to the organized body that only kind of really coalesces at points at which you literally bring bodies together. So, I mean, at that point, I would say they're almost like groups, communities. So I think there's something curious about this. There's something curious about this particular dynamic. I think it's got something to do with the capacity of of the social organisation of a body to be able to cope with dissent and dissensus. I think that's kind of crucial. But essentially, that kind of kicks back into this idea that there's a social tension. There's a tension between being part of the group and being a part of an individual. And that in all of these sort of roles and all these kind of discourses, as the revolutionary discourse, the philosopher's discourse, the sorcerer's discourse, in all of those discourses, if you were to say you're simply sort of reenacting a conflict between group and individual, that's essentially what you're organised like. That's how you're organised. That's what's pushing most of the dynamics. Whilst that would be true, it would kind of miss the point of what's at heart in all of those discourses. What's at the heart of their attempts to exist is their attempts to exist whilst failing and collapsing against this group tension are all attempts to try and overcome or find a different way of organising the relationship to the social. And so we have to kind of try and unpick what underneath the failures are those dynamics trying to do. What underneath those failures of the group individual tension are those particular sort of discourses trying to do, and whether they've got resources, whether they've still got resources, as it were, to try and enable some relationship to the social rather than just a kind of an individualized kind of exit from those spaces, in which someone can still be a revolutionary or a philosopher or a sorcerer, but not an organised one, a kind of one that's kind of been through the process and come out the other end. And I think one of the ways in which I would try and sort of think, well, how would we investigate whether these sort of discourses, which at heart I think do have something interesting to say, but which continually encounter this kind of failure because of the social group individual tension, the social desire, tensions between group and individual. How would we kind of encounter whether they've got those extra resources? I think one of the ways we can do that is by asking about how you'd learn. And so in terms of the revolutionary, where would you go to apprentice as a revolutionary? Where would you go to do your apprenticeship? As a philosopher, you go to the academy, you go to university to do your apprenticeship. It's not particularly the best place, but we can answer that question. If you want to become a philosopher, you have to go to university in some form, do your apprenticeship in some form there. If you want to become a sorcerer, actually, it's not particularly complicated. Getting involved in it is a little bit complicated, and there are all kind of like caveats to this. But basically, you would say, go and get involved in a magical group that's connected to something you're interested in. So if you're coming from a Western Christian tradition, maybe that would be the Golden Dawn or something along those kind of lines. Go and get some training there. If you're coming from Haiti or something, then it might be Voodoo. If you're coming from America, it might be something else, So but essentially there are organizations that exist. They're usually relatively small. But even on a more sort of broad level, if you wanted to sort of get connected, there are lots and lots of pagan organizations now. So there are kind of organizations. So the same thing would apply in a sense if you were to ask, how would you apprentice as a revolutionary? You'd say, well, go and join one of the revolutionary organizations. Go and join one of the actually existing groups. And I think this pushes you to begin to realize that if you want to learn to be able to speak in a particular way, if you want to learn to be able to sort of say as a revolutionary, or say as a philosopher, or say as a sorcerer, in other words, you want to be able to learn to speak in a particular kind of way, you need to connect in with a collective assemblage of enunciation. But if you want to do that, it's always going to be one that, as it were, already actually exists. And that's kind of crucial. You can't, in any of these situations, simply invent from beginning what it is you want to say. And that, in a sense, the minute we begin, I think, to realize that you have to connect with what actually exists, we can begin to see the kind of difficulties, because most of us, and a lot of people who might be interested in ideas like this, are going to resist getting involved in what actually exists, because quite often they're interesting, particularly with regard to being a revolutionary, their interest is in something, beyond what currently exists. But there's a reason for that, and there's a reason for that might begin to kind of speak to why revolutionary organizations have this difficulty with regard to kind of archaic language, and one that kicks back to Russian Revolution 1917, the Spanish Revolution 1936, which is that the revolutionary organizations, and in fact any kind of social organization, even ones committed, like presumably revolutionary ones, to the transformation of the social, can only in a sense exist as organizations insofar as they rely upon something like a tradition, and something like holding a lineage. They're kind of holding a line along a particular, sometimes they might call it a red thread, they might call it something, but they're holding on to a particular line or a particular current within social organization. And the easiest way of thinking about that, I think, is by using the word tradition. They're holding to a kind of tradition. And in fact, you see this language explicitly being used by revolutionary organizations. They will talk about themselves being in the tradition of Marx and Lenin, Engels and Trotsky, whoever, but it will be like a particular, sometimes a particular melange of historical names that they might be in the tradition of. You see this within the sorcery, and you will see a kind of similar thing inside philosophy. You'll find that there are, for example, inside philosophy, it's organized into at least two different traditions, analytical and the continental. Those distinctions are a little less important now. But we see that the actually existing organizations that are able to sustain themselves, seem to continually have this relationship to a tradition. And this speaks to something else that Machinadas mentioned when I was talking about what Sartre says with regard to freedom. Because Sartre says that freedom is something like, make something of what you've been made into. One of the things that Machinadas pointed out to me was it's important to ask the question of what did it take to make you? In part in this kind of connection back into kind of collectivity, or kind of, that you're not simply an individual. And so this kind of interesting, I think, strange connection to the necessity for a tradition for any sustainable organization of bodies points to something that indicates in some ways why fascism is always latent. Because fascism so far has been able to mobilize desire most efficiently because it's used this relationship to tradition precisely to kind of amplify its own dynamic of reaction, whereas revolutionary politics finds it almost impossible to use a notion of tradition explicitly to amplify its progressive politics, whilst needing, in a kind of material way, to hold on to that tradition or hold on to something like a tradition.
Yeah, I mean, you're referring to something called tradition that I would refer to as, say, historical context. So you mentioned earlier Golden Dawn. It has a historical context. We went and did the blue plaque thing for Doreen Valiente. There's a historical context there. And for revolutionaries, maybe the reason they keep talking about 1917 is because they can't talk about 1957, when Stalin's there. Things have to have a historical context, and a historical context that works. And potentially there isn't a revolutionary historical context that works, or at least not one that people have recognised and that people are willing to talk about. So very rarely do you hear about, for example, Open Carry and the Panthers defending black communities in the States, because no one wants to mention Open Carry, so the whole historical context is sort of forgotten, because revolutionary politics always has to be better than what we've got. It can't be predicated
You'd rather
on what
use the notion of historical context. I mean, the reason I would think, and I mean, the reason I'm kind of interested in using the word tradition is because it immediately kind of an example of a notion of tradition. Well, I mean, when we say phrases like "it's traditional to," we're kind of responding to tradition. So it's traditional to have, a Christmas tree in the house at Christmas time. Here we kind of, what we're almost kind of thinking is that we're kind of connecting into this kind of line of archaic belonging that goes back into and beyond history. Is why I'm not sure I'd use the notion of historical context.
Because tradition is often underpinned by power. Yeah, and so what historical context does is kind of let the powerless speak, or let the powerless or the apparent powerless have some sort of stake in what's going on. Whereas tradition, I mean, why we have a Christmas tree in the house, I actually don't know. There's probably some cute parable about it at school or something, but someone somewhere along the line decided that this is how Christmas was going to be, and we were going to have turkey and no one was going to have a nut loaf, and this was all kind of imposed on us. So for me, tradition is not really from the bottom up. It's imposed from the top down, whereas history is an actual thing. It's factual.
Oh, okay.
It's not.
It has facts in it. I'm not sure history is factual, but okay. Let's think of a tradition in sorcery as an example. So, tradition in sorcery would be the Golden Dawn tradition. I mean, that's a tradition in sorcery. Yeah? I mean, and so that goes back. So here, traditions have inventors. Traditions have origins. And I think that's kind of connected to the idea of a tradition. So they have an origin moment, there's a kind of source moment, but there's also this line of organising over time. Again, I'm not sure historical concept, but it's fine.
But you see, what you're saying there is they have an inventor, they have an origin. It's as if you can pinpoint these things, and you can pinpoint these things at exactly the moment someone had power over them. History is a lot more kind of flexible, but than that, it is the thing that it is. If you see what I mean. Whereas tradition, I mean, I think we might be getting slightly off the subject here, but what tradition does is it allows people ownership over a certain thing, and then it allows them to establish that, and then it allows them to kind of like roll that out in some sort of way. Yeah. Whereas history doesn't do that. So if you kind of, in terms of a revolutionary tradition stretching back to, I don't know, the Russian Revolution of 1917, or the Paris Communes, or something like that, if you kind of see them as moments in history, rather than a tradition that's a thread that's tied to the past, then they're moments in history that can be brought into the present, transplanted into the future, and that you can use your imagination to get hold of. Whereas a red thread sounds like some sort of trail of breadcrumbs back to Hansel and Gretel's house or something.
So you're kind of suggesting that something like an objective account of the facts of how things happened is what would be necessary, what would be better here than the idea of a tradition. So people not having, not using a notion of tradition, but using accurate historical accounts, good history.
Okay, right. So I'll give an example. There's a book written by Reed called 10 Days It Shook the World that was also made into film with Warren Beatty in it. Yeah. Anyway, he recounts these two scenes. One is a scene when the Bolsheviks go into the telephone exchange to take control of the communication systems, and all of the telephonists, who are mainly women because it was a gendered occupation then, are absolutely horrified to find these dirty, oafish soldiers invading their nice clean office environment. And it was the horror of these people towards this other set of people who had literally just returned from the battlefront of the First World War. The sort of weird form of morality that was going on there, that he didn't call it into question, he just gave an account of it. And then he gives another account much later where the soldiers are eating, they're just sitting around, they're eating, they're sharing a meal, and the commanding officer knocks on the door to ask them a question, instead of the commanding officer being totally in command and the soldiers just doing as they're told. Now, these are kind of like, he was there on both occasions, the guy that read the book. So these are just like matters of historical fact. This happened or it didn't happen. Yeah, it happened. You know, people agree that it happened. And through doing this doesn't become some sort of strange abstracted concept that we're going to refer to as tradition. It becomes a lived experience, a thing that's totally embodied, and that we can now kind of look back and look at it, not back, but we can look at it and get hold of it as an embodied thing that happened, rather than a pointer towards a time that we cannot possibly know.
Right. So, I mean, I wouldn't necessarily disagree with that idea, that you know, it's a pointer to a time we couldn't possibly know. I mean, I think one of the difficulties is obviously what role each of those historical stories plays. And so, one of the things that I'm curious about is, I mean, let's put question, I suppose, as bluntly as possible. Is it possible to organise social bodies, cultural bodies, like, without something that binds them through time? In other words, you know, can one of the things that the revolutionary, for example, kind of presents to the social is a new future, the organisation of a new future. They're a kind of resistance to, in a sense, the tradition that exists, and so they're a kind of resistance to this traditional way of doing things, but as a kind of position inside the social, as a position that's not, as a position that's not unique to a present moment, that has continued to be there, and continue to try and resist. And that maybe even stretches back. We might even stretch our line back to Spartacus or whatever. But as a kind of way of responding to being a social being, the revolutionary kind of seems to me can't step outside of time. And they're faced with a situation of how do they organise their bodies, their collective bodies, without some kind of, as I say, you know, thread that you might run through. You would call history, and I would just call time here. And within the fascist mobilizations, or within other political mobilizations, of course, you can kind of align yourself, or you can return to invented moments of history. You can kind of reaffirm tradition. Whereas this is this kind of dichotomous moment where it seems like the revolutionary needs tradition and yet must at the same time reject the concept of tradition. And but what we see inside the actual playing out of revolutionaries is precisely this constant return to certain kind of moments of tradition.
You absolute bastard. So you use Spartacus, which, as we know, is a film made under the McCarthy witch hunts in America, that was trying to root out anyone with supposed communist sympathies. That's what that film was about, and indeed it did draw on a historical tradition. You've completely defeated my argument. You knew you were going to.
No, I didn't.
It did draw on a historical tradition of like slave revolts in ancient Greece, etc., and managed to pull that all the way forward 2,000 years into the struggle against like what we'd now call like the far right. Communist witch hunts by McCarthy in America in the 1950s. So yes, I can see what you mean in terms of tradition there, because it does need to be woollier. But I do think you're a sod, you really are. But I do think in terms of this idea of the revolutionary tradition, it does tend to get very, very mixed up because it doesn't have any of its placeholders in history. So a lot of revolutionaries won't know anything about the Paris Commune apart from like the communards that they might have heard at the end of the 80s and something like that. You know, there is the thread is broken, and it's such a thin thing, a thread. You know, it's not a rope. You're not talking about the rope of tradition. You're talking about the thread, the red thread, if you like, and that gets broken, tangled, snaps, all sorts of other things. It's not substantial enough. So maybe that's why I'm banging on about history a little bit, because it feels substantial enough to be able to take the strain of
that makes sense. I mean, I suppose, and I'm gonna wind up in a moment because it's after an hour, so that's kind of, I'm gonna wind up. So to make some connections with some of the things I've been talking about previously, I suppose what I want to kind of think about is what are the images that connect to some of these concepts. So if you think, I mean, you may not be particularly interested in the concept or the image of a revolutionary. You may be more interested in the concept of an image of a philosopher or a sorcerer. But what kind of characters do are the ones that you connect to this? What kind of images? And it's those images. And I mean, the reason I mention this is because it connected to something I spoke about 2 or 3 weeks ago, where the image of the witch is being used at the moment as a particular kind of resistance to the social, and in some sense a very positive way. But what kind of image would attach to, if you want revolutionary change, if you want to change society, what kind of image do you attach to that? And I would suggest that the image that attaches to that goes under the name of the revolutionary. But at the moment, the images that kind of are conjured by that phrase, right? I mean, but the images that are conjured by that phrase are images of people like me, white men in fucking beards, Marx and Engels, or Lenin and Trotsky, or Bakunin, and perhaps we might have some women images. We might have Voltaire, and we might have Emma Goldman, and we might have some Alexandra Kolontai. We might put up that. We might have an image of Cuba and Castro, or we might have Angela Davis. So there's a whole bunch of different images here that are kind of very loosely associated with the idea of a revolutionary. And what I'm sort of suggesting is that kind of that an organization over time needs something that can sustain it over time. So you kind of need a story to tell yourself, mythology or a story or whatever you want to call it. So that's one of the things I would say this role of tradition is, and that story has certain characters in it. And that they have done certain things, like Loki and Thor, and going and talking to the giants. And at the moment, the images and the characters inside witchcraft and sorcery are being reinvented, and we can see them being used in sorts of different ways. The images and characters of a philosophy, they're difficult because they've been subsumed a bit by academia. But when it comes to social change, the images of the revolutionary seem to be deeply, deeply problematic. And this seems to be crucial because the images for fascism aren't problematic. It's the father figure, the authoritarian figure, the one who knows best, the one who can punish, and this can take many, many forms, but essentially it's like a relatively prevalent image of someone who can punish the bad people and help the good people. Benevolently brutal, whatever, that kind of, whatever you want to call it. And obviously Trump and Bolsonaro are picking up on those kind of things. And without the revolutionary movement or revolutionary organization beginning to sort of really re-articulate and remake its images of its tradition, and who is holding the flag and who is on the street, then I don't think it's got much possibility of being able to mobilize desire in a sort of social desire. And I also don't think the answer is to appeal to spaces that are, in a sense, I mean, I wouldn't say aberrant, but are very, very anomalous. So one of the difficulties of the Rojava revolution, which is a brilliant sort of example of a social revolution, is it's entirely anomalous. It's like it's within the Syrian collapse of the civil war. It's within a kind of particular situation in the Middle East. And so you look at it and you don't see a kind of an image that is very easily capable of being moved out into other areas of the world. And similarly with the Zapatistas, they were a little bit more interesting because the Zapatistas began to put masks on and anonymize their face, and so you began to see the kind of construction of something else. But that, I think, is kind of what I'm thinking about in terms of how a revolutionary organizes desire, or the organization of social bodies can take place in a kind of progressive way.
And that's why America's important right now.
America is vital at the moment. It's absolutely crucial. America is undergoing the beginnings of a revolution, and at the moment it has no images for what the revolutionary looks like other than those being produced by the right wing. And at the moment the image of the revolutionary in America is basically the image of Antifa. That's the image of the revolutionary, or the image of the black woman on the streets. That's the image of the
You
revolutionary.
see, I know we've got to finish in a minute, but did you see that post that post I made recently around the Sheila na gig? The ancient Irish, and there's a woman, a naked woman sitting in the street with her, her heels together and her knees on the floor, sitting bolt upright, and she's just facing this fucking sea. She's facing this sea of riot police, and she's completely naked, and she's just holding herself open and holding the space in a way that I think is pure revolutionary, whilst tied to a sorcerer's tradition.
Yes, well, I'll look at that. I'll see if I can share that. Okay, well, I'm going to wander off now. Thank you for Murugan coming along, and thanks for people in the chat. That's great. And chat, the kind of other stream. If you want to see the chat, you can see it on Twitch. If you want to join in, generally the kind of conversations and stuff, then they have Discord. Yeah. And otherwise, I'll hopefully be here next week. Just to let people know that the courses now for the Free University of Brighton are kind of beginning to go onto calendars, and in October I will start teaching a course on Plato and Deleuze, a fairly academic course, but it will be same sort of times, Mondays, at least for the next term. So thanks all, and catch you soon.